Welcome Internet to Psychologist Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing Mental Illness and Psychology by Michel Foucault. So Michel Foucault is a philosopher, so this is going to be quite different, yet there's a lot of parallels between him and psychoanalysis, mainly because he was in that time frame where French intellectuals were very passionate about psychoanalysis. And I would not say he wrote this book in the dynamics of psychoanalysis, but he has a thorough understanding of them, which gives it a very interesting vibe. So what is this book about? This book is fundamentally about mental illness and its evolution throughout history, but also at present, or at least in the present of Michel Foucault, which is the 1950s. So virtually 70 years from where we stand. So I found it very interesting, especially because there's things that haven't changed, and there's some things that have evolved through time, and I'm going to try and bring this perspective with the book, as I think it can lead to an interesting discussion. So in the book, Michel Foucault starts out by listing the pathologies, listing that medical gaze of the patient, meaning that he does explain that mental illness falls into the realm of medicine, meaning that there are symptoms that allow the professional to diagnose, to put a form of knowledge onto the patient and make the patient fall into psychopathological category of illness. And he does list a couple of them. For example, he does list the psychosis with paranoia, schizophrenia, catatonia. He also lists more neurotic symptoms, meaning symptoms of people who haven't detached from reality, like for example what we would call OCD now, and which was called psychasthenia. I don't know the English pronunciation, but in French it's psychasthenie, and basically what we would now consider OCD. And he does talk about people who have an obsessive personality and people who have an histrionic personality, which he called hysteria, because at the time that's how they were categorized. And so basically he does go on to say that basically those big markers of personality are basically, the idea behind it is that the individual was unable to go forward in the development of personality, or that the personality was structured, then broke down, and that they would lead, in case of psychosis, to a dismantlement and a complete dismantlement of personality, which he's against. Michel Foucault does think that there is no such thing as the disintegration of personality, except in very bad cases of dementia. What he means by dementia is what we would now call Alzheimer's, or a more precise form of dementia. And basically he does state that the personality is always there. It's just that it goes back to a certain state prior in order to be able to cope. Or he does also say that it's all a regression to try and cope with what is there in the present, meaning the person has to go back to some state that was more secure, or that, very interestingly enough, that old state is brought out into the present in order to be able to be fixed. So he does say that there is a dual movement here that could be interpreted both ways, which I found very interesting. He does then go on and say that this is the historical based version of this, and that basically with the advent of psychoanalysis, it pushed to the development of trying to understand the illnesses, not just trying to box them in and find the medical treatment as you would find medical treatment for a runny nose or for a cough or for any form of illness. But really psychoanalysis was trying to understand the root reasons, the meaning. And he does speak about all this, especially with talking in regards to Freud, and how Freud analyzed the case of little Hans, which was a young boy that was afraid of horses, because basically he had displaced his castration anxiety onto the horses rather than his father. It's a very interesting case that could be up to a lot of debates, but I'm not going to dwell on it here. The only reason I'm bringing it up is that basically Foucault puts in emphasis that basically Freud was trying to understand and go to the core roots and not just allow himself to be happy with the term regression. But he does, in a way, criticize Freud, because Freud brings in what he calls mythical elements, elements that go in a certain way of fantasy, are englobed in fantasy, namely the drives, the life drive and the death drive, which he calls still instincts, which you shouldn't call them anymore. I think that those translations have been outdated, both in France, especially, that's for sure, but in the Anglo-Saxon countries as well. So we should use the words drive, from what I understand. So basically, he does state that those drives are mythical elements, that they're not really provable, but they do give an interesting framework with which he's trying to understand mental illness, even though it does permeate the text that he's not necessarily 100% convinced. He does bring them out and try and flush them out and integrate them within his reasoning. So that was very interesting. And you can clearly see that with this phase of psychoanalysis, there is also a problem in trying to understand and heal through the understanding of the unconscious world, because he brings in something that I'm very passionate about. He brings in existentialism and existentialism. I'm going to get there, with mostly Binswanger and Heidegger, saying that basically, and I love that, you can see that he's read Binswanger, because he does talk about how the patient is in the world. He influences the world as he is influenced by the world, and it's not just a case of strictly mental illness, but also a whole vision. It's much more heuristic than that. It's the whole world and relationship with the world which is affected. And that was something that I found very, very interesting. He was very, important and interesting to put that forward. And there's another thing that I quite liked, is that he then moves on to give a brief history of mental illness. And it's something that I found very interesting, because you don't often hear it, that basically you have that idea that in the past, mainly in the Middle Ages, and even before that people with psychosis or bad mental illness, or illnesses that were so massive that they were unable to work or to provide, they were rejected and excluded from society. And he says it's not quite true, that even in the 15th century, there used to be a whole interest within psychosis and madness. It was seen as a gateway to something brilliant. And that's something that's very interesting. I hadn't had the knowledge that mental illness was considered as something wonderful. It was not even considered as mental illness. It was considered as a different path in life, something that's odd and that should be in a way preserved. It's only with the advent of religion, and especially how the church started calling on psychiatry and medicine to try and distinguish the religious experience from the psychotic break, that psychiatry really started to basically come into play. And he says that basically psychiatry pulled a power move onto the church, meaning that at the start they were there to distinguish the religious experience from the psychotic experience. And slowly but surely they gained power, and it became that the whole religious experience was in a way psychological and mental issue. That the experience of religion itself could lead to OCD, could lead to bizarre beliefs, could lead to stuff that was pathological. And so basically, I found that very interesting. It's the first time I've heard that basically the church kind of had that backfire, that their will to try and differentiate and create that state of mental illness backfired onto them, because then psychiatry kind of portrayed them in the name of science, but also to grow its own power, which I found that very interesting and not too far from the truth, I think, because it's like any of these things. Groups are going to fight and have internal infighting and try and gain or at least stabilize their power and their knowledge, which I found very interesting. And he does, in his last part, say that basically you can never separate mental illness from the social and cultural context in which it occurs, because from Foucault, basically, one is the answer to the other in a way, in a very subtle way. It's not easy or evident by any means. But it says basically, when, for example, in other cultures, people with psychosis might be attributed special roles. For example, premonitions or stuff like shamanism. In other cultures, the psychotic elements might be seen as gifts, whereas in our culture it's seen as illness. It's seen as something to be medicated and fixed, whereas other cultures might embrace it completely, might see in it potential for guaranteeing certain aspects of the culture, or even as an integration of mental illness within the culture, whereas we don't see that like that. We see that as an illness to be healed, or at least even beforehand to be repressed, like they had to be separated. And that's the other thing that I found very interesting in this book, is that basically he says that it hasn't always been the case in our Western societies that we were to exclude psychotics and marginalize them. That is only relatively recent. Like I think it started like just before the French Revolution, which puts us in basically in the late, I don't want to say anything wrong, but I think it's basically the late 18th century. And basically all the antisocials, because not only the psychotics or the people with severe depressions were excluded, but also people who were antisocial, people who had, let's say, who were libertarian, having a lot of sexual affairs, who were, in a way, off normality because they were having too many affairs, people that committed crimes. All of those people were lumped together and excluded from society. And as society became more open, it reintegrated people that were, for example, committed adultery, or who committed crimes, or who had some form of, let's say, misguidedness towards the standards of the culture. But they did not reintegrate the mentally ill people into it. They were excluded for so much longer. And even nowadays, in our bright future, right, there's still kind of an exclusion, because even though we're talking more and more about mental illness, there is still those a priori, those fears that the psychotics might be more dangerous, might be more violent than anyone else, when in truth they're not, and then even tend to be less violent than the rest of the population. And if there is violence, it's often against them. And that's one of the most severe and biggest a prioris towards them, which means that the exclusion, in a more subtle way, but it still continues. And there's also the whole discussion of, can we really call it an integration if, for example, we let them be but don't care about them and let them sleep on the roads or in the streets, or just not care about them because the hospitals are full. And there's this whole debate of, is it a more subtle form of exclusion? Is capitalism not excluding them also in a more, how can I say, double-binding way, by giving them their freedom but preventing them from having somewhere to go, in a way? Like trying to push someone out without giving them any resources? I mean, I'm not trying to answer those questions, but I'm just asking the questions. And I think that that's basically what Michel Foucault is trying to ask, is, can we separate? And he answers that clearly we can't. Psychosis is part of the culture, and in a way, the culture is part of psychosis. And he does say something that I love at the end of the book, that basically psychology can't understand anything about psychosis, because it's trying to understand it from a viewpoint of science, of observation, when the lived experience is so much different. And in a way, the only hope psychology has is for mental illness to understand it, that it's the other way round. Rather than psychology understanding mental illness, it's mental illness that in a way truly understands the discipline of psychology by its lived experience. And I found that wonderful and great. So anyway, I hope you liked the review, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.